Hello, everyone. My name is Zachary Corzine. I'm a freelance motion designer, visual designer, currently based out of San Francisco. You may also be familiar with some of the work that I post on Instagram as Zach Darren. I just want to give a huge thanks to everyone at Maxon and all the incredible people within the community. I have a background in design and transitioned to motion design a few years ago. And since then, I've been freelancing with various advertising agencies and studios and some direct-to-client work. And I think one of the greatest factors that facilitated that transition was learning through like personal projects and personal experiments. So that's what I'll be talking about today. But first, let me show my reel to give you a sense of my work, and then we can jump right in. Thanks so much. All right, so I'll be talking about learning through experimentation and exploration. And experimentation is extremely valuable as a hands-on and more like visceral approach to learning. And it's a great way to sharpen your problem-solving skills, which is really at the root of every project that you tackle, both client projects and personal projects as well. And it's really helped me develop my own personal voice and vision that I can then express on client projects and really get a sense of the work that I want to do moving forward in the future. So here's some of the projects I'll be kind of running through today. These are just experiments that I came up with when honestly just kind of playing around, trying to learn and have fun in Cinema 4D. So we'll jump into the first project here. And I have a reel put together of a few different animations using this technique, but it's basically this approach to shader-driven dynamics. So we're able to have shaders drive both the scale of the object as well as its transition across a color spectrum, right? So we have a kind of gradient, and it transitions as well as kind of scales up. And there's a bunch of different kind of use cases for this, and the first project I'll be jumping into is this last one here of this kind of undulating wave with these dynamic cylinders. And the cool thing is I'm basically just using a noise to generate this now, but you can use even an image sequence or whatever you'd like. And then also jump into, let me jump back to the beginning here, this project as well to kind of show some of the techniques behind this. So let's jump in here. And the way that I kind of approach experimentation, right, is just like building from the ground up. So we kind of lay down a foundation, and then we can kind of layer on from there. So for that undulating wave, we can just create a plane, and I'll just kind of scale it up here, and we'll just use a displacer. So I'll grab a displacer, and we'll throw this in. And for the shading, I'll just use a noise here. And I need to up the segments because we just basically need some more polygonal resolution here. So I'll up this, and we need to just basically scale this up here. So for global scale, I'll just scale this up to something like 3000. And we need to introduce some animation, so I'll just use this animation speed here. We'll just set it to something like 1. And then we can, under the object, increase the height as well. So now we have our wave animation here, but we need some geometry to introduce and clone onto the surface. So I'll just grab a cylinder here, and we can quickly rescale it how we like it. I think that's pretty good. And I'll add a fillet here just to give a nice kind of edge for the light to catch onto as well. You can just set that there. And I'm going to grab a cloner. I'm just using Shift-C here, which will basically bring up this dialog box that's just super useful. If you are familiar with After Effects, there's a plugin by Video Copilot called FX Console. It's kind of the same thing. So you can just type in whatever you're looking for here. So I'm going to grab that, and we'll throw in our cylinder. And I want to set this to object mode, so then we can drag in our plane. I'm going to first turn on render instances just to be nice to our viewport here. And we'll drag in our plane here. But right now it's set to vertex. You see we're getting way too many clones. We don't want that many. But we can change this to surface mode, and then I can add some more clones. So we'll do maybe like 3,000 here. And we have the wrong orientation. We can just jump into our cylinder and change the orientation to the Z. And now if I press play, we're starting to get what we're looking for. But this is a really kind of boring static effect, right? They're just kind of mapped to the surface. So we want to, I'm just going to increase our frames here. We want to introduce some dynamics as well, right? So I can just, on the cloner, I'll add a rigid body simulation tag. And first things first, we need to change the individual elements to all, just so all the individual cylinders are being affected here. And I'm actually just going to drop out this bounce and friction here. We don't need that. And if I just press play now, you'll see that they're dynamic, but they're all just falling, right? They just fall off our plane. And we want them to match with the plane while also being dynamic. So there's a pretty straightforward way to do that. I'm just going to hide this plane here. So if we jump to the force tab under our dynamics body tag, we can, you'll see there's this follow position and follow rotation. And basically what that is if we have keyframed animation or animation that's being driven by parameters like this, you're able to blend between. So it'll follow the position and follow the rotation of whatever you're animating while also remaining dynamic. So you kind of get to blend and get the best of both worlds. So I'll just set this to something like 5 for each. And if I press play now, you'll see they're dynamic, but they're also following our wave, right? So we're getting a blending in between the two. And the cool thing is that you can kind of, once again, drive this with whatever you like while also getting dynamic. So it's not as apparent right now because there's not as many clones. So when kind of building this out, I do less clones and then before rendering kick it up. So, but once you introduce some more clones, you'll see in some of these pockets here that you start to get some jittering because there's just too much energy, and we need to drain some of that energy out, right? Because in a natural environment, if this was playing out, there would just be some more energy drain there. So how we can do that is there's this linear damping and angular damping, and that'll just help us kind of drain that energy so we don't get all the jittering in the pockets where all the clones are kind of clumped up there. So that's our kind of foundation, right? So now this is where the experimentation comes in. This is where the fun comes in of playing with the rest. So I'll close this and open up the next scene file I have prepared here. So it opens up here. And this is basically the same build that we just created. It just kind of dialed it in to my liking here. So we have our dynamic clones. Now, when I was working with this, I wanted to, let me just restart this here. I wanted to actually map the height of the wave to the scaling of the clones, right? So there's a pretty straightforward way that we can achieve that. So if I grab our cloner and we grab a shader effector, right now everything turns white because color mode's on. We don't need color modes, we'll just turn that off. We're just gonna use these transform modes here. So we can set the scale maybe something to like 1, and then for position, I want them to, as they grow, to kind of move up as well, so then you get some of them that are kind of like crowd surfing on the others, right, as it transitions. Oop, I'm going to do that. So I'll add a little bit of Y transformation as well. And to get the mapping of the height to the scaling, we can just grab that same noise that we used for the shader effector, right? So I'll just copy that and paste that into our shader here. And now you see they're all scaled up, but I want to target specifically just those ones. So we can do that pretty easily by this low clip and high clip. So if I clip this down, we can up our contrast a little bit. You see now we're targeting just the highest points in the displacer's height field, right? So now we're actually getting, as we kind of let this play out, the wave moves along and they all kind of dynamically shift, and you'll see as they scale back down, the clones will kind of fill in the place as well, and you get these nice sections where some of the clones get caught on top. And there's a ton of different ways that you could drive this as well, rather than just the noise here. So now that we have our scaling being mapped to the height field, I also wanted to map the material as well to transition along the color, as you saw in a lot of those examples, right? So I can open up the next scene file I have prepared here as well, and we'll jump into also mapping the material. So this is same build. I just layered on some additional shader effectors, just kind of dial things in. And to get the color that we'd like, we can use another shader effector. So I'll grab another one here, and we can rename this so we know what we're doing. To color, and we're not going to use any transform modes. We don't need any of that, but we'll keep that color mode on. And we just need an image to drive this. So I'll just create a standard Cinema 4D material. We're going to turn off the reflectance because we don't need that. And then under color, I'm going to grab an image here. So I have, jump in here. I have this image of just like an aerial topographic map in black and white, which works pretty well, but you can use whatever you'd like. And we'll drag that onto our shader effector. And under the shading, right now it's set to custom shader. We need to set that to color because that's the channel that we are using, right? So we'll change that to color, and we can drag in our texture tag. Now I'm using Octane, a third-party renderer. So I'm gonna basically get that information into Octane so we can use it, right? So if I send this to render, you can see it's just kind of standard setup here. And we want to get that information into Octane. So just make this added in. So I can just create we'll just create a standard Octane glossy material. And we'll open this up, and we can jump into our node editor here. And down at the bottom, there is MoGraph color shader. So we can utilize that. And let me move these out of the way so we can see a little clearer. And I'll just pipe that into our diffuse for now. And if I drag this material now onto our cloner with our clones, you see we're getting that black and white data from the shader effector to the cloners into Octane. But we don't want just black and white color. That's kind of boring. So we can introduce some color as well. So I'll just grab, I don't want that gradient. Let's see. We can grab a gradient node, and I'll just pipe that in here. And we can start to select some of our colors. Just reposition this here. So I can maybe grab like a darker purple here. Just quickly grab some colors. Like a blue. And like a golden yellow as well. So you can see it's directly correlated to our clones. And the same way that we kind of low clipped and high clipped the noise to target the clones we wanted, we can move along this gradient to target specifically those. So if we wanted just the largest clones to be affected, we can reposition these however we'd like. So now you can see we're getting that color data from the color shader into Octane, and it's all dynamic and all mapped to essentially the same height field as well. So that's kind of the basic build behind a lot of those techniques. And this is really where the experimentation comes in. This is kind of just the path that I went down with when exploring and running into some different dead ends, and landed on this one as well. But I'm going to pause this and close these down just to be nice to our demo machine here. But we can open up this next setup, which is the first render here, right? Rather than mapping them to a surface, they're all left purely dynamic and left to play out. So what we can do here is I just have a kind of stripped down version here. We just have basically the same setup, but they're all kind of left dynamic. But if I let this play, let me send this to render real quick. And if I let this play out, you'll see like the clones are too uniform. Like we're not getting enough variation. These all kind of lay out the same way. It's not really natural or organic or what we're looking for. So we can introduce some turbulence if we wanted to. So I can add in the turbulence here, and we can crank this up to something like 150. But if I press play again, you'll see like, yeah, we're getting some turbulence here, but it's affecting all the clones. And I wanted to have some of the clones that are being unaffected, so you get some more variation of the clones pushing against each other. So what we can use here is, if I press pause, under the Falloff, rather than infinite, we can use new to R19, the noise Falloff, which is amazing. I've been using it a ton. So let me grab that here. And one of the great things about the noise Falloff is the display options, right? So if I'll turn off the X, I'll turn on the Y, and we'll just scale this up here. I'll do like 1,010. Add another 0 here. And you can see we're actually getting visualization of our Falloff in the viewport, which is super powerful. So now I can dial this in. I'll scale it up a little bit. We'll change our noise here. I'm going to use like a wavy turbulence. And I'll just use that clipping again just to basically add some more contrast between, just to kind of exaggerate the effect as well. So Super powerful, being able to have a very one-to-one hands-on understanding of how the Falloff is being applied. And if I press play now, you'll see like some of these clones are being unaffected by the turbulence. Some of them are getting the full amount of turbulence. And you could even, if you wanted to, introduce some animation speed to the noise Falloff as well. So then it's animating and you get some even more interesting variation. So I'll just open up this next scene file here, which is basically that final render just with less clones, just to be nice to our viewport here. And let me send this to render really quickly. And basically, what I did here is layer on some additional turbulences. I'm using an attractor with some negative values to basically repel from that central color blast. And you see we get just this much more interesting variation. So like, I really love this corner here that kind of lays out flat. These are twisting around. You can see some of these are being unaffected and kind of being pushed out as well. So just much more natural, much more organic way to get some variation between the clones and how they're being affected. So that's the basic kind of run through of the shader-driven dynamics. I'll just quickly kind of show some of these projects again. But once again, this was just kind of quickly put together using various noises, but there's a ton of potential you could use with driving it with other shaders and even an image sequence if you wanted to as well. So I'll cut this short a little bit. We can jump into the next project I want to talk about is this approach for effectors triggering dynamics. So you can see here we have this stack of cubes, and they transition both in their material and their color, their form, and their dynamic state as well. So I put together a few different renders to kind of show off this technique, and this is all being powered by a single plane effector. So it's a super light rig, super light build, and you get a lot of control over a bunch of different parameters as well, which is really cool. So this one, you can see it's kind of transitions up into this flower structure and then transitions back to its previous state and collapses. This one's similar to the first. It's just introducing different materials and different forms as well. So we can jump in on how to build this out, and once again, it's easier to tackle these things just kind of building from the ground up, right? So we'll start with the most basic. Let me just close this down real quick. Open this up. I just have a simple scene set up with some lights and an environment. And to start off, we'll just start with our foundation, right? So the kind of base thing is we want to transition from that cube to that sphere. So we can do that by, I'll just grab a cube here, and we can resize a little bit. I'll add a fillet again just to give some more natural edge to catch onto there. And then we're going to utilize a cloner to get that transition. So if I grab a cloner again and we throw in our cube, I can just tweak these settings a little bit. We'll kind of move them out here. I can set this to a bit more clones and kind of reposition this here. And I just have a pretty basic metal material I'll just throw on top as well. And so for us to kind of blend between those two, we can utilize in the cloner, right now it's set to iterate, we can change this to the blend mode, which is super powerful. So if we want to transition from this cube to a sphere, I can't just go into the objects and grab a sphere, because the cloner needs to understand, it needs to have the same base geometry to understand how it's blending between the two. So we need to keep this same cube, but we can just copy it out. Oh, let me undo that here. We can copy this out, and I'll set this one maybe to be a little bit bigger. We can do like 300 by 300. And you can see there, it's already blending between the two. And to get our sphere, we can basically just crank up this fillet. So if I crank it up all the way, we essentially get a sphere. And I'll add some more subdivisions just to kind of smooth it out a little bit as well. So we're getting our blending between the two, right? But we don't want the cloner to drive the blending. We want to drive it through a plane effector. So how we can do that is, you'll see that this first one here is basically being unaffected. It's not blending between the two. So if I set this count to 1, this will be our kind of child cloner that's driving the blend. And then I can grab another cloner, throw this inside here, and this will be our parent that's actually populating all the clones of the blend, right? So I'll just set this up quickly the same way. We can drag this out. And if I make sure to select the blend cloner here, because that's the one we want to have the plane effector drive. I'll add in a plane effector. Under the parameters, we don't want to use any transform mode, so I'm just going to turn off position. But we do want to use, at the bottom here, you see this modify clone. And that'll basically allow the plane effector to modify the clone that's being used. So it'll allow it to drive the blend. So if I turn that to 100%, you see they all change to our spheres. And then I can set that to a linear fall off, and then we'll just kind of reposition it a little bit. And you'll see now we're blending between, we're allowing the plane effector to control the blending between the objects. And one of the cool things that I found out when playing around with this is that not only can you drive, the form, you can also drive deformers, which another project after this I'll be going through briefly, but you can even drive the dynamic states. So if I grab both these cubes, we'll add rigid body tags to them both. And this first one here, I just want to basically make it static. I don't want it to have dynamics. But once again, I can't just delete this tag because the cloner needs to understand how it's interpolating between the two, how it's blending. So we can basically just use the damping again to make this one static. So if I set this to 100% on both here, it's essentially, draining out all the energy, it's static, right? So if I press play on these and we start dragging this across, you'll see we're transitioning to the form and then also the dynamic state as well, which is really cool when you, I'm just using a simple linear fall off here, but you can use whatever you like. And if I kind of let this play out, you can see that as you drag back and forth, these become dynamic again. They can pop up. You can freeze them back in time. And do whatever you'd like. But so now we have the plane effector driving the shape of the object, the dynamic state, but we also want to drive the material. So how I'll do that is similar to the last project, but I'm going to use an Octane Mix Material. And if I open this up, you'll see it gives us 2 channels to add in materials and then this float texture. And I have pretty simple glass and metal material here. Just add those in. And the float is basically, it's just a value from 0 to 1 or black to white, telling or inputting the information of what material to use, right? So if I drag this all the way to the right, you'll see it's the metal, left, it's the glass. But we want this to be not driven by a float, we want it to be driven by the plane effector. So what we can use is, I'll go back to MoGraph and drop in a color shader here. And under the plane effector, right now, the parameters, we're only using the modify clone, right? But we can turn on this color mode to start getting some of that color data in. And I'll delete this material that I have right now and add in our mix material here. So now you can see that, let me resend this here. Oh, one more thing I need to, actually under the transform, you'll see right now the color is white. We actually need to change that to black. So it gives, the cloner is giving some color data, and if we change this to black, it'll basically drop out all the color data. So now you see it's working. So that's one thing to be aware of, is the cloner is by default set to white, and so it's going to input some color data. Make sure to set that to black, so then the plane effector is the only thing driving color data here. So now if I, let me drag this back out. I actually want to, switch these materials. I kind of like it the other way. There we go. And if I press play, we can drag our plane effector, and you can see now we're controlling all these parameters as before, but now we have material as well, which is super cool. So I'll jump into the next scene file, or I can quickly show as well some techniques for basically introducing some more forces as well. And I think, actually, I'll just jump into the next one here because it'll be easier to demonstrate. Let me close these down. I'll throw this in here. So this is a similar build to the last one. I just kind of set up a grid array with a bunch of different clones. And under this plane effector, I nested in some wind and some turbulence and set their fall-offs the same as the plane effector. So now all we have to do is animate this single plane effector, and we get these all transition in their dynamic state, their form, their material, and they're also receiving the forces as it travels along, so they all get blown away. And once again, the cool part is, just for demoing purposes, I'm just using a linear effector, but you can, linear fall off. But you can use whatever you'd like and get some much more interesting effects. And another use case for this that I've actually used in a client project is to kind of get this freeze in time, right? So it's like if you have some dynamics that you need to have play out, you can easily let them play, and then get them kind of frozen in time as you'd like them. And if you drag this out, you'll get more of a sense of, some of these are starting to like begrudgingly come to life and move, and you get a really cool transition as well. So that's the kind of base build of this technique, and I will jump into a stripped down version of the first animation here, which one other thing that I wanted to call out is you can see we're kind of getting some like soft body look here on some of these spheres. They're being deformed and kind of changing their shape. And how I approach that is rather than having all the heavy simulation of soft body is I just utilized, let me open this up here. I just utilized a displacer in set to world mode. So I have a displacer with a noise applied, and you can see this world space, right? So I wanted to nest it with the plane effector, so we can have this single plane effector driving the forces, driving the material, driving all these parameters, and then also driving this displacer. But I needed it in this stack, right? So the displacer needs to be in the stack of the objects to actually displace. So I just used a simple constraint tag to constrain it to the plane effector, and then let me send this quickly to render. And so as the plane effector travel along, it also pulls the displacer along. So you kind of get this pseudo soft body looking effect without all the heavy sim. I turned it off for this because it does slow down your viewport a bit as well. And then the cool part about this is you can see we're getting a bunch of different materials. And it's because this parent, this like master cloner here, is the one that's populating all the objects. But these blends, you can just copy those out, create different material sets. So I just created a few different materials. And you can also create a bunch of different forms. So maybe this one, let me just reset this here. Maybe this one I scale up a bit, like 400. And we can let this play out now, and then you can introduce some different varying objects as well. So you'll see this big one kind of finally pops out there as well. And you can have some control over how they're populated with this parent, right? So under here, it's set to iterate. You could set this to random, so it's completely randomized how the clones are being populated in that stack. But ton of potential for this technique, and super light build, super light rig, just being driven by a single effector. So let me close this out here. So as I mentioned before, not only can you drive all the parameters that we've run through, but you can also drive deformers using the same blend as well, right? So I have this example here of clones kind of reacting to a target. So you can see we have this target object that passes over all the clones, and they're all reacting to it, being deformed and kind of reaching up towards it. And there's different use cases you can use for this, and we're driving the material as well. And this one here, you can see they're all kind of orienting themselves, deforming, and changing their shape. So this is using the blend as well. So we can jump in real quick on how to tackle this. So I'll just open this scene file here. I'm actually going to close my live viewer. I don't need it for now. So to get that blend between the two objects and to have them react to a target, we'll just grab a cube again really quick. I'll set this to maybe 800 on the Y. We'll crank up the fillet here. I'll add some more subdivisions. And what I want to do is introduce some deformers. And you can use whatever deformers you like. For this example, I just used a taper to kind of get a teardrop effect. So I can make that a child of my cube, make sure to hit fit to parent, and then we can introduce some strength as well. So I'm starting to get the shape that I'm looking for. And we can add in a bend. Make sure that goes after there. Also fit to parent, and we'll add some strength here. But right now, you can see it's not actually matching that bend shape, and that's because we just don't have enough segments on the Y. So I can add some more segments here, and now you see we're actually matching that curvature properly. I'm just going to make these two deformers visible in the viewport just to clear up our space here. And we'll grab a cloner again. This is going to be kind of basic run through as the technique on the last one as well. So we can copy out our cube, and this cloner will set up kind of similarly. I'll drag this out. You can add some more. And for this first cube, I want it to, we basically had those flat stacks of cubes, and then it reaches up towards the target as they travel along. And so for this first one, I want to basically make these mute, but once again, we can't just delete them because the cloner needs to understand how it's interpolating. So we basically just turn this off, but we need to keep them in our stack. So we can turn these off here. And I'm going to make these like a little bit shorter. And right now it's set to iterate, so it's just iterating between our two clones. So we'll set this to our blend mode, and now we're getting our blend between the non-deformed object and the deformed object. And right now they're transforming from the center. We want to transform from the base. So I can just quickly group these to basically give us a null to work with, and just kind of reposition these here. Let me jump into my side view. We can quickly reposition it. That's pretty good. So now they're transforming from the base as we like, right? So once again, we don't want this to be driven. We don't want the cloner to just be blending between the two. We want to drive this with Effector. So I'll set this back to 1, as we did before. This will be our cloner that's driving the blend in between the two objects. And then we need a parent cloner to actually populate that grid array that we're using for all the clones, right? So then right now it's set to linear. I'll change this to grid array mode. And we don't want any on the Y. I'll just set it 1 on the Y. And I'm going to just scale these out a little bit. And I'm going to change this mode to per step so that when I add more to our count, they're spaced properly how I'd like them, right? So now we have our kind of setup here, and we want to introduce a target for the clones to react to. So I'm going to use a plane effector again, similar to last time. And under the parameter, I'm going to turn off position. We're going to turn 100% on that modify clone. And this time for the Falloff, we are going to use this source. So this will basically allow us to have a source link that within a certain sample distance, the clones will react to. So I'm going to just use a sphere similar to the test render. We'll add in our sphere, and under the plane effector, Falloff, we'll drag in our sphere into that source link. You'll see nothing happens right now because we need to set the sample distance. It needs to know how far it's going to sample. So if I set this to 1,000, now you see that the clones are only reacting within the sample distance here. And this is starting to get what we want, but in the first example, you see they're actually kind of reaching towards it. So we need them to reorient towards the target as well. So how we can do that is I'll select our blend again, and I'm actually just going to use a target effector. And under the effector, we can drag in a target object. So we'll use our sphere again. Right now, pitch is on. We don't want pitch. We'll turn that off. And they're actually not angled properly, so I'll just have to jump into my cube here and change this angle. I think it's 90. Yeah, so now they're reaching properly towards our target. But right now, they're all, universally reacting. Even when it's outside the sample distance, they're all orienting themselves towards the target. And we want it just to be within that sample distance, right? So we can just set up the Falloff on the target effector similar to the plane effector. So I'll set this to source as well. We'll drag in our sphere, and we'll add a sample distance the same as before, 1,000. So now we're getting what we're looking for. Only the clones within the sample distance are orienting as the object travels over, and you get these clones to react to the target, what we're looking for. So just to wrap up on this, I just threw together a really quick fun scene file. So what I've set up here is 2 sets of clones on either side, and they both have dynamics tags with this sphere in the middle, and they are basically both reacting to the same targets. We basically get this procedural game of ping pong that all we have to do is serve up the ball and then let it play out as it will. So you can have multiple sets of clones reacting to the same target. You can use it however you'd like, as before, using that blend effector is super powerful. You can control so many different parameters, both the deformers, the material within Octane, its form, and anything else as well. So I'll just quickly show the final look with this, with additional clones added on a delay to kind of get some more interesting bounce between all the different clones as well, and a ton of different uses to kind of allow your clones to react to a target and to utilize the blend deformer in a variety of different ways to drive different parameters. So just to wrap up here, I just wanted to touch on why I hold experimentation and exploration so closely to my heart, and it really has helped me, teach me so much about both myself and my work, and like myself as a designer, right? So just some closing points in that regard. Problem solving really is at the root of every project that you'll do, and it's the one skill that I really hold the most valuable. And doing personal projects, doing work outside the 9-to-5 client work really helps you strengthen that muscle and really develop it further and further. So I think spending time to kind of problem solve and try to either recreate effects that you've seen or just dive in to Cinema 4D and play around really helps you strengthen that muscle that translates beautifully to other client projects that you work on or other personal projects as well. It's really important to kind of get a visceral understanding of the tools. It's kind of like the age-old story of the engineer that really wants to understand how the toaster works, so he takes it apart and puts it back together, right? I feel like that applies both also in like the digital space. And if you spend a lot of time, if you're working on a project and you're not sure that what you're doing is going to work, you're probably going in the right direction, because that's where the really big discoveries come. And kind of getting a sense of where the boundaries are, where things kind of break, allows you to adjust from there and really come up with some big discoveries in that regard. You hear this a lot, but it really is true. Do the work you want to do before you're paid to do it. I wouldn't have any of the opportunities that I have today if I didn't spend so much time doing these personal projects and really, spending time to show your own personal vision and your own personal passion for the work. So hustle in your off hours, do the work, especially if, there's a realm of work that you're interested in and client projects aren't getting you there, then, it's really important to spend that time outside of the normal client projects to develop into those new spaces. So thank you so much to Maxon and everyone else within the Cinema 4D community. If you want to check out my work, you can check it out at zacharycorzine.com. I also post a lot of personal work and some client work as well on Instagram as Zach Darren. So thank you so much. This has been amazing.